What today is done by Army sergeants of the Bundeswehr from A7 onwards was, 50 years ago, the daily bread of non-commissioned officers at A5, especially by those who had been trained at one of the two Army NCO schools. Because after 21 months in branch schools or training battalions, they were practically the crème de la crème of the Army's A5 non-commissioned officers. They were far ahead of those who had been trained as NCOs within the troops, both in theory and practice. Only older staff sergeants, members of the so-called OAS, the Organization of Old Stufse, could keep up with them. Back then, the A5 NCOs were not any less smart than today's A7 Feldwebel. On the contrary, back then everything was still done manually, whether at the aiming circle, in the fire control section, at the gun, or in the tank, and all done in your head without computers, GPS, or lasers, just to mention a few things. But when the quality of the NCOs trained at the HUS became increasingly noticeable in the troops, they were disbanded again after only 8 years of existence. The one in Sonthofen in '72, and a year later, the one in Aachen. This was thanks to the mediocre defense minister Helmut Schmidt and his advisors, General Wolfgraf von Baudissin, who had become increasingly left-leaning and retired in 1968, and Professor Thomas Elvine, who had always been on the left. Among other things, the commission named after him even wanted to abolish the position of attention, since it was considered, quote, a repressive element in the cooperative relationship between superiors and subordinates. And although I believe that even among the younger generation, you would find enough volunteers who could be recruited for highly qualified training, there is no longer such an overall concept for the training of young non-commissioned officers. However, the Bundeswehr is now supposed to grow, and more non-commissioned officers are needed. The Bundeswehr, which has already shrunk to 185,000 soldiers, is currently lacking around 24,250 non-commissioned officers, and this cannot be remedied by sugarcoating or by pouring in more and more money. Therefore, I want to explore whether it would make sense now to reintroduce non-commissioned officer schools, to set them up in the old way, where applicants who have chosen the profession of soldier and the career of non-commissioned officer would receive a completely different kind of training than what exists today. Because non-commissioned officers, together with the soldiers they lead and officers up to the battalion commander, have always been the ones to decide the outcome of the battle. While you could dismiss 50% of the generals and admirals tomorrow morning without anyone noticing. In any case, the General Oberst Beck Barracks in Sonthofen, known as GOB, and the Army Non-Commissioned Officers School in Delitzsch, Saxony, are already available as two properties, where the training could take place, and you would only need to rely on the tried and tested training content, which of course are still highly relevant today, adapted to the new threat situation. This would also increase the attractiveness of serving as a temporary service or career non-commissioned officer in the Army, in addition to the qualification already offered that can be used in civilian life. In my opinion, this also includes offering the opportunity to earn the Abitur for those serving at least 12 years. It's hard to understand why young officers are kept away from the troops for years during their important first years of service, sometimes for up to a year, before they start from the 67th month, that is, after 5 years and 7 months, they attend a platoon leader course. But the non-commissioned officer corps is still basically treated the same as it was in 1956. In any case, I would like to present to you a training path for aspiring non-commissioned officers that already existed until 1972 and produced top non-commissioned officers. They mastered everything that a sergeant does today. Although with the current generation of sergeants, Some can't even march in step anymore. A disgrace for a quasi-professional army. The property in Sonthofen, which is still used by the Bundeswehr today, bears the name of Colonel General Ludwig Beck, one of the main participants in the coup attempt of the 20th of July 1944, who died by suicide on the same day. After the Second World War, it was known as HUS Thrm and served as the first central training facility of the Bundeswehr for prospective non-commissioned officers in the Army. This idea was not exactly new, because the first non-commissioned officer school was opened in 1824, with the first Prussian non-commissioned officer school division in Potsdam, in the building that now houses the Justice Center. Over the years, 6 more were added. In 1877, 8 preparatory non-commissioned officer schools were established for boys aged 14 and older. But unlike the non-commissioned officer schools, where military training was the main focus, the preparatory schools primarily promoted the general intellectual and moral foundations and physical fitness needed for a future career as a soldier. Since the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles prohibited the establishment of non-commissioned officer schools and preparatory schools, the first schools were only created with the reintroduction of conscription in 1935, but then in large numbers. However, among them were also several high-ranking German post-war generals. Colonel General of the National People's Army, Fritz Strelitz, was a graduate of the Unteroffizier-Vorschule in Deggendorf. The Bundeswehr's Surgeon General, Dr. Horst Hennig, UVS Marienburg, and the UVS Dresden graduate, General Dr. Gunther Kiesling, who from 1982 to 1983 was Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, when the first 154 volunteers with an initially planned service period of 4 years on the 1st to October 1964 began their service at the newly opened Army Non-Commissioned Officers School 1 in Sonthofen in the Allgäu. Until then, the training of the Army's prospective non-commissioned officers had taken place at the respective branch schools or directly in non-commissioned officer training companies in the divisions. But in addition to the, one must say, dramatic shortage of junior non-commissioned officers, already at that time, there were about 32,000 junior NCOs missing in the troops. Among senior and junior NCOs, the glaring difference in junior NCO training had also become increasingly visible to the military leadership. Because with the shortage of junior NCOs, especially in the combat units, people often turned a blind eye during NCO training within the brigades, which did not necessarily improve the quality of the junior NCO corps. So it was high time to finally introduce standardized training for aspiring junior NCOs. The Barracks, which from 1956 was called Colonel General Beck Barracks, was opened in 1934 as one of 3 so-called Ordensburgen, and until 1945 it served as an elite boarding school for the Adolf Hitler schools, which were Nazi-oriented and part of the Hitler Youth. As a training center for the Nazi youth, here, too, among the former students, you find 2 prominent post-war West Germans. The co-editor of the weekly newspaper Die Zeit, Theo Sommer, who, by the way, also belonged to Helmut Schmidt's left-wing advisory circle, and the versatile actor Hadi Kruger, who made a name for himself with impressive stories of resistance, which, however, were never verifiable or were denied by the protagonists mentioned by the co-editors. But when the young volunteers began their service in 1964 in this Bundeswehr barracks, which was only referred to as a castle, there was probably no one who saw anything more in this barracks than just a normal Bundeswehr barracks, since at that time there were no eccentric West German historians of either gender who would have been interested in such buildings erected during the era from 33 to 45, who would have introduced the term evil buildings into the world for such structures. For the 18 to 19-year-old junior NCO cadets, as they were now registered for the next 21 months of their military service by the Army's main personnel office. The weekend excursions to Oberstdorf, just 14 kilometers to the south, and frequented by female tourists looking for company, were definitely more important than deep reflections that a different spirit had prevailed in their barracks 20 years ago. After the war, the French army took over the barracks. Then, from February 47 until 52, the U.S. Army operated the Central Training Facility for its 38-man Special Police Force, the U.S. Constabulary. And from May 51 to February 52, there was also a basic training center here, a training center of the U.S. Air Force. Then, from 1956 until its relocation to Hanover in 2009, the Bundeswehr Military Police School had its military home here. Furthermore, until its move in '78 to Warendorf in Westphalia, the Bundeswehr Sports School was here, and, of course, the Army Non-Commissioned Officers School 1, or HUS-1 for short, which opened in October '64. It had two teaching groups, Groups A and B. The latter was responsible, among other things, for Course B, a kind of preliminary course for sergeants. Teaching Group A consisted of 3 companies, as they are called in Army schools. Each platoon, every second of the first inspections, had 4 groups and was led by a first lieutenant or captain, assisted by a deputy with the rank of sergeant. There were also 4 group leaders, non-commissioned or staff non-commissioned officers, and 1 corporal per group serving as assistant instructor. They wore the school's sleeve insignia on their uniforms, as well as the HUS-1 cuff title, while the students only wore the armband. The training to become a non-commissioned officer at HUS took place in 4 phases. First, Course A. This lasted 6 months, during which an extended and in-depth basic training was conducted. And regardless of which branch of service you had committed to later, during these 6 months, the entire spectrum of infantry training was covered. The field training took place at the local training area with the meaningful name Hill 996, with the number representing the elevation in meters. For the non-commissioned officer students, most of whom came from the lowlands, this elevation was always a challenge, especially when climbing it in a skirmish line or skirmish group while wearing the NBC protective mask. Theoretical and practical weapons and shooting training also took place, with all infantry weapons, G3MP, UZI, P1 light anti-tank rocket, handheld flamethrower cartridge, hand grenade, stun incendiary hand grenade, and rifle grenade. Infantry combat training also included the motto, Life in the Field, a 1-week bivouac, with accommodation in 2-man tents, so-called Dachshund garages, or in shelters at the Bodelsberg military training area near Kempten. Lessons on leadership and law were partly conducted by Bundeswehr legal officers. Furthermore, all Unterwitziger students had to take the Bildungsprüfung II, and specialized teachers taught English. In addition to intensive drill training, there was comprehensive physical training, including swimming. Finally, all Unterwitziger students obtained the Bundeswehr Class C driver's license on Mayen 5-ton trucks and went on a 1-week educational trip. After this 6-month, broadly based military training, there was a 1-day inspection as part of a mountain march, followed by promotion to Gefreiter. After that, the transfer for specialized basic training and full training took place to a unit chosen in part by the Unterwitziger student, almost always training battalions, where the Gefreiter received his first unit insignia for the uniform, here, as an example, that of the Tank Destroyer Training Battalion in Munster. In the training battalion, the 4 to 6 month full training specific to the branch took place in a company, where the Unterwitziger student, now a Gefreiter, was taught basic skills for his future assignment as a tank commander on the gun or missile tank destroyer. In addition to the shooting and combat training with the tank destroyer in the field, infantry training according to ZDV 3-11 was further refined, as well as drill and weapons training. Starting in 1968, a 2-month preparatory course was introduced in the battalions for soldiers eligible for the Unterwitziger course. This was followed as the third training phase by the 3-month Unterwitziger course at a branch school of the respective branch. During this course, the Gefreiter was trained as an Unterwitziger candidate, meanwhile wearing the so-called Hope Stripe as a joke, both as an operator and user of his weapons and equipment, and as an instructor and squad leader in his future unit. After successfully completing the Unterwitziger course, the Unterwitziger student would either return to his company as a squad leader for 3 to 4 months, or serve as an instructor in a training section of the troop school for his branch. For the Unterwitziger students who did not pass the U course, their status as fixed-term soldiers ended, and they were downgraded to the status of conscripts with 18 months of service. For all others, after 16 months of service, they were promoted to Unterwitziger. After another 2 months as a squad leader or instructor, so after a total of 18 months of service, they then went back to the 4th section to HUS 1 in Sonthofen. To complete the 3-month Course B, the final methodological and didactic part in the training of an Unterwitziger student. Unterwitziger student. Many from Course A met again, but qualified Unterwitzigers also joined. Staff sergeants were also added, who had not previously been trained at the HUS. During this course, the focus was on being prepared as a future junior leader, instructor, and educator. Therefore, during this course, the student was required to give numerous teaching demonstrations from all areas of training. This applied to all typical military training subjects, as well as, in particular, to sports, where everyone had to complete either the sports instructor or assistant sports instructor certificate, as well as obtain authorization to award the German sports badge and at least the basic certificate from the DLRG and the Bavarian Water Rescue Service. During this course, a 14-day basic commando training was also conducted. Below Mount Grünten, at the Winkel camp near Sonthofen, there was a lot of marching and shooting, but also hand-to-hand combat training with and without weapons. After completing this 4th phase, by which time 21 months had passed, we said farewell to HUS 1 in Sonthofen. Now the NCO trainee took off his cuff titles and, as an excellently trained NCO, was transferred to a troop unit that would become his future military home. As everyone can understand, the 21 months of continuous training to become an NCO, without the later civilian-style 41-hour workweek that was also supported by the always obedient generals, was in no way comparable to today's NCO training, and also not with the training in regular units 50 years ago. However, that was one of the consequences, that due to their training advantage in all areas, the NCOs coming from the 2 Army NCO schools were often viewed with suspicion in the battalions, even though there was no advantage in promotion, salary, and so on. But it was precisely the self-confidence paired with their top-notch training. This NCO was, to those responsible at the time, who questioned everything, especially the traditional line to earlier German armies. Such a horror that the schools were dissolved without replacement for flimsy reasons. It went so far that for 1.5 years they had turned the Bundeswehr into a ridiculed long-haired army. The parliamentary commissioner for the armed forces said that the appearance of long-haired soldiers was sloppy and dirty. The Army NCO schools, 1 to 4, founded from 1990 onward in Münster, Weiden in the Upper Palatinate, Lahnstein and Delitzsch, were not comparable in any respect, nor was the only remaining NCO school in Delitzsch after the merger, with 2 additional locations in Sondershausen, Thuringia, and Celle, Lower Saxony. However, I can assure you of one thing. If, which of course will not happen, one of the civilian or uniformed officials were to ask me, what, in my opinion, If someone were to ask me what the reason for the catastrophic lack of non-commissioned officers since the establishment of the Bundeswehr is, I would tell him something that would make him tremble. And another thing, when a nation of 84 million people and its army, from whose every gun barrel quadrillions of euros are pouring out, and if a nation of 84 million people and its army, which afford themselves the luxury of 220 generals and admirals, can't even gather 2,000 volunteers per year for training at a non-commissioned officer school, especially when you have to subtract the now usual 25% dropout rate, then the federal service flag should be replaced with this impressive flag. But what do you think of my suggestion? Should we reintroduce the old-style non-commissioned officer schools or leave everything as it is? We want your opinion.